When I first started here and I was onboarding, I was seeing a lot of long form threads. And my first impression was, okay, I thought threads was for like short communication, like, hey, everyone, here's a strategy doc. Here's a link to the memo. But I've seen long form threads communication that I would say, whoa, that looks like that could be a memo.
Mhm.
Uh, how long is too long for that initial thread when you post it to a forum?
Not at all. So it's a good question, but I think should be reframed as like, what is the intent of the information being communicated? So we're going to talk about this idea of Threads versus Notion. These are two platforms that we use internally for communication, but the idea is not necessarily around platform, but that becomes semantic. It's more around principles of when to use certain platforms and why. So, framing it as Notion could be replaced with Google Docs, Threads could be replaced with Slack, email, whatever communication form some people use in different companies. But internally, the way that we use Threads and Notion are very different and they're distinct. And I think it's hard because sometimes it can be confused, like when to use one and why. What is Threads? I know there are other videos about this, but Threads is basically email meets Slack. It's an internal tool for communicating ideas back and forth. It's not meant to be synchronous in nature. It's meant to have like long, thoughtful communication. What is Notion? It is a giant database where we can warehouse like long form documentation. So, why would we use one versus the other? Probably the easiest way to break it down is that Notion is for memos. And a memo can be based on a reference document, a strategy document, or a project doc. Like this video right here, as meta as this conversation is, has its own project doc that lives in Notion. When collaborating on a thing or getting feedback on it, it's not efficient to get the feedback in that Notion doc. Sometimes you can get comments that are changing minor things. But if you're, let's say you're working on a project, that being this one, what would happen is you create a project doc in Notion and then you dump it into Threads. You tag whomever you want the feedback from, and then you can start the conversation and it becomes publicly visible. So that's setting up sort of the idea of like, what is Threads versus Notion? One is just for capturing documentation, capturing thoughts, and the other is for feedback or visibility on thoughts, communicating about those thoughts in that document as a team. So hypothetically, if somebody has an idea they want to put forth, right? Let's call it about level swag. And you're not sure if somebody talked about it. You couldn't find any documentation in Notion, assume it didn't exist. Level swag. Should we do it? Right? This is before a Notion doc exists. Hey team, one, two, three, like all this background is here. Questions at like tag somebody at Tony. Does this help you? Right? At like you name somebody else at Tom. What are your thoughts? Whatever. And this ends up being this really long thing where we're having a thorough discussion. There's no reason in having a Notion doc yet. This ends up being 20 like responses, gets really deep engagement from the team. And the takeaway is like, no, we shouldn't do swag. Why would it be inefficient to have a Notion doc? Well, it wasn't a project. We didn't move, it wasn't a reference doc. It wasn't a project doc. It wasn't an initiative we undertook. We could technically, you could document in Notion that might be appropriate technically as like a retroactive thing, a postmortem to be like, we discussed level swag. We decided not to do it. Here's the outcome. That might be like a 5-minute document to put together because it's really short, just to make sure you don't lose that thread if you ever wanted to reference it. But that's not necessary. Like this wasn't a project. If this became a project and we move forward, That's where we would create a Notion doc, right? We need to capture results and metrics and what happened and learnings so that we can always reference them down the road. And those documents help other people get ramped up when they come on board. The reason not to start in Notion with all that long form communication is because, like, you could spend the hour putting together this doc and the answer didn't get 20 responses. The answer might be right away. If you, Mike D is already doing this, right? He's already doing this, and we actually call it clothing. And the reason that the person couldn't find it in threads is because they were referencing swag instead of clothing. So this hour was just invested in like writing a thing that was really thoughtful, and then it's not useful. So the starting point for some projects can be, I'm going to ask in threads, what do people think about this? Now, other times it might be like, you don't really need to ask, hey, should we put together an audio or a video strategy doc? It's like, we just know inherently that's like an important part of like the core pillar of multimedia assets is that it's more a matter of, you can just dive into Notion. It's a strategy doc. You need to transmit a whole bunch of smart information with links to other docs. Then you communicate it in threads, and a team has a really, it could be a long conversation or it could be a short one. So that's kind of the example of like, when do conversations get long and when can they be short? It's like, the answer is both. This swag one is a great example of like, the outcome could be two completely different things. It might be a 20 responses, or it could be, we've already done it. It's called clothing. And then somebody would actually link like the Notion doc where it exists. Let's use the example of the audio strategy doc. And it is quite long. So there's this huge side panel of comments too. But comments are feedback about granular things. Like Casey said, what are the top 5 episodes? Like, that's a granular thing that just lives in this doc. It's not really giving feedback. It's just sort of like digging deeper into it. So anyway, we still need to communicate to the team like, hey team, we created this doc. How do you do that? Well, so we created a thread about this in a forum. So a thread being a new posting within a category of a whole new level. And we said, hey team, here's an audio strategy doc that we created. Here are some of the takeaways, what we're going to do. The TLDR is like, we're going to test this out. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Sort of like the action items from the memo. There's the Loom walkthrough, but it gives people enough of a sense of like, this thing exists. Then this is where we give feedback as a team, right? We start having these long form conversations. Let's go back here. That becomes a pretty inefficient thing to do through comments because you're highlighting a thing in Notion. What am I going to do? Comment and tag, and then that becomes a thread? Like, that is not very visible to people. So it makes sense to do it here. So this is where it's asynchronous, transforming information between two people. A memo is not about transforming information. It's creating the information that you want to transmit. To start to have real conversation is threads, right? That's where you want to take this information and say, like, let's have a conversation asynchronously and digitally around this. And this is like a nice lead into some of our other, like, when to focus on async communication versus when to meet synchronously. So this in particular, there are a bunch of ideas pertaining to the action items, right? And that's, I think, where this conversation stemmed from. The good old, hey, the podcast feels like the Homer Simpson car right now because we're just doing anything and everything. And it's kind of funny, but it's also like, we're just having this open discussion and it's pretty light. So this post started on November 12th. And over the course of, this would not happen in a normal meeting. You don't have a meeting that lasts for the final post, but before we decided to go sync, is 11:30. You wouldn't have an 18-day synchronous meeting in any company that exists in the world. You might have like 9 meetings over the course of those days, and you're a lot less efficient with time. But what ended up happening is there was a lot of conversation back and forth over the course of this time because it was all asynchronous and it was really thoughtful what everyone was putting in. The suggestion was, hey, we're having a deep conversation. There's not necessarily a deep disagreement going on, but let's get aligned. Let's have a synchronous call. Let's get aligned and let's make sure that we can put a bow on this and we can move on with the next step. Say for the next 6 months, next quarter, it doesn't matter. Here's what we're all committing to because that will be the most efficient. And I think we even said, like in this case, suggested next steps. Here are the people on the call because it's expensive. We're just going to have 3 people on the call, which is like the most we ever want to have. It gets to this point where once we have alignment through a synchronous call, then we can update the Notion doc to say decision. Here's what was made. We'll also update threads to say like closing loop. We meant sync 1, 2, 3. Da da da. That's what we're doing, right? We'd even say like we updated the audio strategy doc to reflect this, whatever, right? By doing that, everyone's in the loop. We've updated the doc because the reason we want to update the Notion doc as well is that we don't want to get caught up in process and bureaucracy. And that's not the point. It's that we want to have a reference point because we're going to link that doc again. So we want to make sure that we've got that. Like that doc doesn't just go off into the woods and die as some link that we never reference again. We'll use this as the foundation. Hypothetically, we copy all this information in and we're like, since the last time we did this thing, whatever, here are our learnings. By having that document, by having it updated, like the takeaways we agreed on were like 1, 2, 3. That just sets the foundation for what we're going to work on next. So that's why it's like back to why would we update threads? Why would we close the loop? Why would we do all these things? And why do we use both those platforms? It's because we're constantly transmitting information through Notion and transforming it through threads. The takeaways are that every project, strategy, reference doc should have a thread, but not every thread should be in Notion.